Hello, welcome to my T-Rex reflective video. The first thing I did when creating my T-Rex was gather together a decent amount of reference images. This was really important to help me gain an understanding of the shapes and muscle forms that I intend to recreate. Obviously there are loads of variations of the T-Rex, but I wanted to look at all the different styles just to see what was already out there. I looked at existing in-game models and tried to find out as much information as I could on the workflow used to create them. This did prove to be more difficult than I'd hoped, but generally speaking, most artists would start on 3ds Max, create a base mesh on there, and then import it into ZBrush, or just use ZBrush and use Z-spheres. I also gathered quite a lot of reference images on the face of the T-Rex, as I personally felt to get a menacing and realistic T-Rex, that detail on the face would be most important. I also made sure I had a lot of detail on the skin and scales of the T-Rex, as you know, the main detail that would need to be on it. Anyway, once I had a good amount of reference images to work from, I decided to jump into ZBrush. And I haven't usually used this workflow before, of using Z-spheres first, but it looked like a good way to make sure my forms are right, and it's always good to try something new, so I thought I'd give it a go. Initially it didn't go so well, and the mesh turned out a little bit unsymmetrical and strange, so I had to take that into 3ds Max. In 3ds Max I fixed the topology of the bad Z-sphere model and made it a lot more workable for ZBrush. From there I re-imported into ZBrush and begun my sculpting. Before I started my ZBrush sculpt, I thought I'd look around and try and find some decent guides to follow and learn from. And I came across this ZBrush tutorial monster size sculpting tips from BBC's Planet Dinosaur. This is the workflow of Matthew Calling from Jellyfish Pictures. He covered all the necessary requirements of modelling a dinosaur, and this was a really useful find. He didn't just not only go through about creating the forms of the dinosaur, he covered the scales, the wrinkles, the folds, the teeth, the eyes. It had everything needed in here to help me learn how to create my own. He also talked about layers, which I hadn't previously used before, but turned out to be very helpful when adding scales and wrinkles. He also goes on about how to do scars on the dinosaur, and that is something I initially intended to do. If you can see on my unwraps, I've got, instead of overlapping the legs and arms, I had them separate because I intended to have wounds that that I didn't want to mirror. In hindsight, it would have been better to have them stacked on each other because I didn't even use the unwrap to its full advantage anyway. Yeah, alpha variations. That played a big part in adding scales to my dinosaur. I'd never used this before, but I got scale images from Google and used them as my alphas to cover my dinosaur in scales. From my thread here, you can see the actual progression and steps I took to create my final sculpt. Initially I just sculpted in the base forms and the shape of the dinosaur just to get the layout and base to work on. From there I added a little bit more detail. As you can see on the head there's some lines, some wrinkles, some folds. I've also started to define the muscles a little bit on the arms and the legs, and there's underbelly there too. After that it was the case of adding the scales and the folds to the dinosaur. You can also see on his feet I've added some thicker scales to match some of the reference images that I had before. I wanted to go for a more realistic style of dinosaur, not the over-the-top stylized kind. In hindsight, I think it would definitely have been a lot better to make the scales a lot more pronounced and have much deeper wrinkles and recesses in the dinosaur, as Stu mentioned later on my post. Once I finished my sculpt, I uploaded it to the Polycount forum. I uploaded several images just to try and get as much feedback as humanly possible. I did get quite a few replies. For instance, D. Walker said the claws were too round, thinking more like a bird. They were all very helpful when I took them up on what they said. I changed my poly sculpt because of that. Here was my poly paint. I'll go over that in a second. But as you can see in this bottom picture here, I have made the claws more like a bird and less round as they previously were, as you can see in this picture. I used polypaint to texture my model, as I've just said, but seeing people use it, it definitely looked the most efficient way, so I thought I'd have to give it a go. the actual polypaint process went relatively well. I used the mask by cavity option to get into the um, recesses of the dinosaur, and yeah, it all came out quite nice. Um, Getting that texture onto my low poly model, however, did become quite an issue, and I'll go through that in a minute. Um, I did post my polypaint texture onto the Polycount forum. Um, that was on 17th of April. Unfortunately, I haven't had a reply since, so I didn't get any good feedback from that. Um, the next step I took was to unwrap my low poly model. As I mentioned before, I didn't overlap the legs and arms and hands um, because I wanted to add more detail. But obviously, as I didn't add more detail, it was an extremely bad waste of space, really. But either way, that's how it turned out. Um, Once I did get the text into Photoshop, it was a case of neating it up because obviously once it's come from a polypaint, it's a lot more pixelated than it should be. So after neating up the entire model and adding a few bits of details here and there, the diffuse was done on Photoshop. The normal map was generated through a high poly model and the low poly model using X normals, as was the ambient occlusion, which I did place over my diffuse. The specular map and specular power map was generated on Photoshop also, along with the emissive. Once I was finished texturing the model, I added the bones. This was a relatively simple process, as I used the CAT system. It made animating the dinosaur a lot easier. However, once the rigs were in place, the template walk cycle wasn't quite up to standard, so that required a lot of tweaking and editing in the motion editor. Once I was happy with my animation, I imported the model into UDK. As you can see here, here was my finished dinosaur textured. Some screenshots in the basic setting. Here's a quick video of me controlling my dinosaur, making him walk, and testing out the animations. I do feel like the body is a little bit rigid when the T-Rex walks, and the idle animation also is a little bit stiff. Yeah, these are things I could have worked on the motion editor, but time wouldn't allow it. I used the UDK material editor quite a lot. Yeah, I felt this was a really good tool to make the texture come out a little bit nicer. I used Multiply, Add, some Fresnel. Yeah, it all came out quite nice in the end. Here's the finished turntable. On reflection, I think the normal map would need a lot more detail. The scales definitely didn't show up enough, nor did the folds. Also, there is obvious signs of seams in the dinosaur, and that is something I wasn't sure how to fix, and time won't allow me to correct the mistake.